Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to our 121st Right and Left Discussion Forum. We hold our televised discussions twice monthly to demonstrate the value of civil, productive, open-minded political dialogue. Today, our panel will discuss the controversy over the reinstatement of the citizenship question on the 2020 United States Census form. By the way, what's the plural of census?
Well, it's the Latin word, it'd be sensi.
Yeah. You would think, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Today's panel, beginning on my left, is Bryan Laubaugh, President of R&D Financial Services. On his left is Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, retired senior research chemist. On his left is Patty Haskins, member of the Wadsworth City Council. And on her left is Jerry Ritzman, co-founder of Ritzman Pharmacies. Bryan, after 70 years of not asking for respondents' citizenship on the U.S. Census short form, Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross announced that the question would be included on the 2020 form. Some on the left think that the question will cause many undocumented immigrants to avoid the census for fear of being deported, causing an undercounting of U.S. residents. Secretary Ross claims that the decision was made to help reinforce the non-discrimination section of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Somebody's not telling the truth. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I really don't have a problem with it, and let me tell you why. Over the years, I've been involved in indexing projects, and I don't know if you've ever done any indexing, but our church and other organizations like Ancestry.com and stuff go out and they have teams of people that microfilm records, courthouse records, birth records, draft records. They get census records. Now that information doesn't just get magically digitized so that people can go in and search that information.
But the Mormon Church built this huge database.
Right.
And for Ancestry
Ancestry.com, Ancestry Research, and we share that for free. Anybody can use it. It's a wealth of information, and when you're trying to find people and you're trying to find your people, you know, more information is better than less information. And I've seen enough census information to, you know, it doesn't bother me. There's some census, you know, there's basically they're asking if they're black or white. There's some other information that they collect, but when you take a look at the censuses over the years, or the censi over the years, it's almost, to me, a non-event. This is a tempest in a teapot. You know, census workers, I think one of the issues is when they go out and they actually visit, you know, they actually go to a person's home depending upon where they're at. It's not just one of those things they go to a courthouse and look up records.
Yeah.
You know, just be honest with them. I don't know why having your citizenship is that big of a deal. And like I said, they've asked a variety of questions over the years. I'm for more information is always better, because when it comes down to people wanting to find their people, it's better to have more. I'll give you a case in point. I was doing some indexing of records of Indian reservations, and they were asking individuals what tribe they belonged to. Now, you know, this was information back in the 1900s, 1910, you know, 1920. They were sort of like mini census done on reservations. They had their Indian name, they had their English name, you know, and that's a wealth of information. And so, you know, maybe back then someone could say, I don't want to tell you what tribe I'm from. You know, I don't want to tell you I'm a Hopi or I'm a Navajo or an Apache or whatever. But because they did, it's so much easier for these search engines to find people and the people that, you know, you want to look for. So that's the basis I'm coming from. I really struggle with the notion that somehow, you know, people aren't going to be, I mean, there's enough people when they go to the hills and the hollows of West Virginia, you know, census people get shot at. I think they had a census person with the last census was killed.
Really?
Really.
Oh my goodness.
I'm not joking. I mean, you know, he went into someone's little farm and, you know, never made it out of there. So, you know, you really, I think more is better than less. So I'm open to others' opinions on this, but I really don't see it being that big of an issue.
I am betting that Ron has a different point of view.
I'm sure he does.
Well, that's quite fascinating, Bryan. I'm certainly aware of the Mormon Church's efforts in that kind of thing, in ancestry. I haven't come to a personal conclusion about this at this point. I can see some of these arguments on both sides. The idea of, it seems to me there's a couple of principles here. One is, do we base our census, and we're talking here about political representation. We're talking about electoral college votes. Do we base this on eligible voters, or do we base it on warm bodies? And one way or the other, it's a way of getting at that. I can understand the paranoia, if you will, from the immigrant population. In view of the xenophobic attitude of the present administration by the bigot in charge in the White House, all the statements he has made, I can understand.
That's not fair, Ron.
Well, the heck it isn't. Listen, look at all his statements during the campaign about Mexico, and look what he's done trying to do with the Muslim community. Some justified, some not. All of that sort of thing that's going on. There's a xenophobic thing. Last time we talked about this, I mentioned a couple of cases that I knew personally about, where immigration enforcement is after some folks for no particularly good reason. And we're seeing things all the times where folks, undocumented immigrants who have served in the armed forces, have perhaps medal winners, are being deported. Some of this justified, some of it not. But I can understand why the immigrant population would be very, very nervous about this at this point.
The non-citizens.
The non-citizens.
Yeah. Patty, I'll bet you agree with Ron on part of what he said.
Yeah, when I looked at this, I mean, from a constitutional standpoint, which is what requires the census, it does not say that we're required to have this count of all citizens every 10 years. It says to provide a count of all the people in the country. Mm-hmm. So that means citizens and non-citizens. Yeah. So to then put a question on there that asks if you are a citizen becomes questionable, because the only purpose of the census is simply to find out how many people are presently living within the country. I understand, the idea of tying it to the voting rights. I think that's a little.
It's a stretch.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit of a distraction. I don't think that that's the total purpose of it. The concern that I have, and it's not just illegal immigrants, it's legal immigrants, those that are here on a visa or have a green card. They need to be counted because they are living within a community, and we need to know how much aid needs to go to that community, how much money has to go for the roads or for whatever facilities they have, because that's an additional person that is living legally within that area. Mm-hmm. The concern is that the legal immigrants as well will not answer the census for fear that it is a way of tracking non-citizens and then in some way, shape, or form come after them. And there has been a lot of concern raised on that point. I saw an article, it was a couple weeks ago, in the Beacon Journal just on this matter, and they were looking at the city of Akron. And Akron has, I'm probably going to get the percentage wrong, but it's something like 7% immigrants living within it, which is a very high percentage. It's higher than the national norm and higher than any place else in the state. And they've already found out by discussing this with them that many of these immigrants are not going to answer the census for fear of giving that information to the government that they don't necessarily want out there. And that this could severely affect the representation and monies that are then brought in for not only Akron, but all of Summit County. And there are many areas like that. Now, when you weigh that against the reason to do it, I don't think that we need to have that added. And it just, it just looks a little questionable when you realize that the climate against immigrants is high, whether it's because you think one thing of the president or of the administration. But if you just look at the climate in the country now,
Yeah, are you talking about immigrants or illegal immigrants?
both.
Didn't matter.
It doesn't matter, all of them.
Us and them.
Yeah, it's whether it's illegal or but those that are not citizens, let's say, immigrants that are not citizens, whether they're here legally or not, that this, with the climate that we have presently in the country, I think that perhaps they should just not put that question on if they truly want to follow the Constitution and get an accurate count of the number of people within the country.
Mm-hmm. Jerry, what are your thoughts?
Well, I have questions.
Sure.
What again is the reason for the question, and how is it going to help stop discrimination that's prohibited by the Voting Rights Act?
The Voting Rights Act, Section 4, requires every voting jurisdiction to be able to identify the citizen over the age of 18 in order to determine if there are 10,000 or individuals or 5% that are language deficient in order to provide English language deficient,
Right.
in order to provide bilingual voting materials. And you must know what percentage of citizen voters in your jurisdiction in order to determine whether or not you need to provide bilingual voting materials.
Well, I could be an immigrant and not be disadvantaged lingually,
That's true.
or I could be a citizen
there are
and not. So I mean,
Well, no,
it
on
just
the
doesn't-
form,
it just
on the
doesn't.
form in question 8, it asks if you are a member of a whole slew
Right.
of immigrant populations, include a whole lot of Hispanics. Hispanics, by the way, are no longer considered a race as of the last census. But you also somehow indicate whether or not you are able to completely understand English written voting materials, instructions and ballots and all of that.
See, that doesn't, to me,
But if
that
you
doesn't
check-
have anything to do with citizenship.
It does, because only if you're a citizen can you vote.
I understand that.
And and if you're able to vote, you require a ballot that you can read.
Right, I agree.
And it takes a certain percentage of people in a voting.
I agree, but I could have been born in the U.S. of parents and in a household that spoke a foreign language,
Yeah.
and I'm a U.S. citizen because
Yeah.
I'm born here and I'm registered to vote, and I can't read or understand English. What's that got to do with my citizenship? And I'm just,
It doesn't.
I'm doing that's a rhetorical question.
If-
So I don't have to say,
If you can't read English and you are a citizen, then you're identified in a group that requires a
well.
voting material printed in your language.
I think
If
the
there are
cons-
enough of you.
I
Yeah.
think the concern there is that you are skewing the number of electorate for the people in the electoral college and the representation in a certain direction.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the overall concern, and that you're also gathering information on immigrants.
and what determines, whether we get a representative or not? The number of residents in an area or the number of citizens in an area?
I think it's residents.
Whether they're citizens or not?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, I have a problem with this question because of what happened with the Japanese population.
Yes.
Because the Census Bureau for years said, no, we didn't reveal that national origin question that they answered back in the 30s. We didn't reveal it, and they actually did.
Yeah.
They finally have admitted it and apologized for it. And they put all those folks in internment camps. And I'll agree with Ron, the mood, the anti-immigrant, the anti-foreigner mood in this country is starting to concern me. And maybe it's because I started reading a book about how the U.S. and the Western European countries totally turned their face to the plight of the European Jews during the 1940s.
Yeah.
I mean, there was plenty of evidence, plenty of news out there of what was going on, and the administration in the U.S. and Washington pretty much ignored it. The newspapers put it in the back pages, and boy, I would hate to see that happen again now. I mean, is it happening in Syria? Is it happening in places like that? I don't know, but if I were an immigrant, if I were not a citizen, I would be very reluctant to respond to that.
Mm-hmm.
And Bryan, I know the
Legal or
reasons
illegal.
to respond are great, but if I'm looking out for my own personal benefit and the welfare of my family, I would really be nervous about that, because the intent could be the greatest. What if there are data breaches and somebody that's not authorized gets a hold of this stuff? I don't know. I mean, it's possible. So
I guess, yeah, and I understand. I think I'm sympathetic to individuals that might not be here legally. And I go back to some of the questions that have been asked on other census. Where were you born? You could look at that question and argue it.
Yeah.
You know, that's clearly a question that's been asked over many censuses. Where were you born? And you get a lot of people, you know, Germany, Yugoslavia. It's a whole smattering of people, and they might have looked at that and said, I don't want to tell them where I was born, you know. You know, and I guess this is just sort of the conspiracy side of myself. You know, there's so much out there as far as your profile. So much is already known that I don't know if this, you know, is to the extreme of answering a census question, because I think the information that we have on individuals here already is enough to do whatever they need to do, whether it's collect people off the street. I mean, I don't know if you've been watching these Facebook hearings with Mr. Zuckerberg, but that's scary. And you know, what do you do about it? Is it a census question, or is there maybe something more that needs to be done so that, you know, the footprint that we have, you know, they're talking, Britain is now in the process, and some other countries are, China is putting in facial recognition. You know, artificial intelligence that actually recognizes people, and they know when Ron goes to Bueller's or when he gets his oil changed and all that kind of stuff.
Facebook already does this, you know.
I'm worried.
You know?
I'm more worried about when you like something that you've just, you know, you've just added another piece of information. So yeah, I'm probably not so much concerned with that, but I can appreciate, you know, the feeling of people that aren't here legally answering that type of question.
Yeah, this information in one place would be the mother lode, because it's already there and collated and organized. If somebody got into this, it would be, man, they had all their work done for them.
There's no question in my mind at all that whether you're on the left or the right, this whole issue boils down to trying to get political advantage. We're not only talking about the number of representatives in a state, but the reapportionment and all of that. And the big question that I have, if the citizenship question is required in order to reinforce or order to enforce the Voting Rights Act of '65, how did they get the information for the last 6 censi?
Exactly.
Because they haven't asked it since 1950.
Well, and
why
the
now?
fact, and the fact that many parts of the Voting Rights Act have been put aside now, is we don't need them anymore. Well,
the part about the southern states.
Exactly. So if we're so concerned about the Voting Rights Act and how fairly people are being represented, that would have never happened. You know, one of the interesting things I saw when this came out on television and they were discussing it, is there were a couple of attorneys, and they said that one of the other concerns is number one, you don't have to answer all the questions on the census. So when it got to that citizenship portion, you could just simply not answer it. The concern, though, is if you're really worried and you think, oh, but I better not let them know I'm not a citizen, I'll mark I'm a citizen, then you've committed a crime. And you could be arrested for it. Yeah, so you're...
I never answered one that said to ask race. Race has no biological meaning.
It's obsolete. As a concept, it really is.
Yeah.
Eric Holder has filed a lawsuit on behalf of citizens of Maryland and Arizona, I believe. And in the lawsuit, they're claiming the things that we've talked about, that it's going to suppress the a number of people that register, and that the community survey that is done between census done in between is adequate
See what you started.
to determine.
Yeah.
My question is, now we've got every 10 years we've got the determination about congressional representation and the I keep wanting to call it gerrymandering, but it's the reapportionment of states.
Right.
But we asked the citizenship question on the American survey that Holder says is adequate. But they're asking for citizenship and other things, like how much are you paying for your housing and so forth.
But it's still not the census, and I think if we keep true to the Constitution.
What is it, by the way? The American survey, who does it?
I don't even
It's
know.
the Census Bureau, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's
It is
part
the
of
Census
it's part of
Census
it, but
Bureau,
the
they
actual
hire people.
census itself is simply to get a count of people. And if we need to do that, as the Constitution says, you know, every 10 years, then we just simply need to count the number of people. Now, I remember as a child, they used to come to the house, and you would have, and it took forever to get census takers to come to the house. Now they only go to the house, I think, if you don't return the form. Isn't that correct?
1990, my wife did that in Connecticut. She went out after the mail notice. She went and drove around communities and tried to find houses of people who hadn't answered the census, knock on the door. And
You know, and there's so many things that are affected by that. Even
That's dangerous, isn't it?
Absolutely.
you know, even your attendance at schools. I mean, schools use that to know how many people, and because they get the number of people in the family, the ages, and it's really imperative they have an accurate count, so they know how many people are going to walk through those doors, so they have enough teachers and supplies. You know, small things like that in the big, over the big picture, really means that you need to get an accurate count of people. And I think the best way to do that, just in my mind, is to not put some of these issues in there that could cause people to refrain from actually answering questions or answering them truthfully.
There was my thought. I've been an adult for 5 rounds.
I was going to say for 5 years.
Since for 5 since I.
Okay.
And I've never filled out a form. I don't ever remember.
You never filled out a census form?
No. I've never gotten one. I would have filled it out. And I would have told them I was a citizen without any question.
Oh, that's interesting that you never. I mean, I remember getting them in the mail and just filling them out. And I remember as a child them coming to the house.
I remember that.
Yeah.
Never did.
Maybe
But-
your wife did it for you.
Could be.
Yes.
Or maybe I've just forgotten.
Because you've gone through 5.
Could be. But there are a lot of people that agree with Bryan's take on this. The more information, the better. And in and of itself, the citizenship question doesn't bother me. Excuse me. We're still in the middle of February, right?
Yes,
feels like
yes.
it.
February 126, I think.
Yeah.
No, it's more like 70. But the it's hard to imagine that a census could ask for too much information.
I think they want to make it easy. If they send out a form that is 5 pages long, well, actually it is. It's pretty long now, but people just aren't going to do it, and then that makes it more difficult to actually get an accurate count because you have to send out the poll workers and so forth. I think the shortest form possible makes it easier, and you're going to get a better return. If it's a 2-question form, it's going to, or how many people live in the house, and the ages or something like that. Okay, I'll just go ahead and fill this out and send it in.
Yeah.
When you start to make it too long, people have a tendency, unfortunately, to just toss it away. So,
Well, Patty, wouldn't they send a short form and then that longer form only to like a representative sample to get more of a sample?
I think that's what
don't
happened
know.
last time.
Is
Yeah,
that what
I
it
think-
is?
yeah,
I
they-
don't remember.
Yeah, you may have received the short version and a number, just a selected number where they mathematically calculated this would,
Yeah, 'cause I think mine was
that you'd get a
long.
long form.
I think mine was long. That's why I said when I said 5 pages, I thought I remember pages that I had to
Yeah,
turn on.
right.
So
I remember my parents, it must have been 1950, it wouldn't have been 1960, or I wouldn't have been talking to them about it. But 1950, talking about how the census guy would come door to door, and that if you were home, they would ask you as many questions as they could about your neighbors. How many people lived in the
really,
house? Yes.
Oh well, that maybe they couldn't get into the neighbor's home.
Or
Yeah.
just in case they couldn't, they're trying to gather
Yeah.
as much information. Maybe if they got enough, they wouldn't have to
Because I
knock
think
on
that
the door.
was I think that was allowed if you couldn't reach. If the person wasn't at home, you could go to a neighbor to just get verification of somebody that lived there. Interesting.
It seems to me there, on this panel, there's almost a consensus.
Consensus.
Consensus is the root word, isn't it?
Consensus, yeah.
Yeah, that
Go
it's
with
not
consensus.
really necessary. Brian thinks it's useful, but
Yes.
Right.
I would
Yeah.
agree.
that would
Yeah.
be about it. Well, thank you very much, folks. That was a. I'm sorry that my voice gave out on me partway through there, but
You haven't been carrying your cough medicine recently.
no, I've been taking my chest stuff though.
Comedians.